So first of all, here's the question we're considering today. What are we seeing in relation to faith across the Western world at the moment? Are we seeing something new? Are we seeing renewal? Are we seeing resurgence of people in church? Are we seeing revival? That word has been used. The signals really started, I think, from the UK. There has been talk along those lines for some years, and some of us might be fans of particular podcasts in this area. But earlier this year, a report came out from the Bible Society UK, which people hailed as proof there really is something happening. The report was called The Quiet Revival. Oh, the green text down the bottom is not doing well on our screens, but hopefully you'll pick it up from what I say anyway. Report from the Bible Society UK. They do say at the outset, oh, it's not a revival in the old evangelical sense, okay? We're not seeing another Welsh revival or something like that, which would be wonderful and amazing. But they're saying it's still revolutionary, they believe, in terms of what it means for public assumptions of Christianity in the UK, at least. Claims that decline in church attendance has halted and that growth is now occurring in the number of people going to church. Also claims that it's largely driven by young adults who their results said had quadrupled in the number who were going to church in the previous 5 years. They said it contributes to a falsification of the secularization thesis. In all parts of the world, it seems to have become more religious, and finally Western Europe and even the UK might be catching up because they were not. They were seen as outliers. So big claims. However, not everybody believes it. Not everybody is convinced. And I'll point you to one particular scholar, Professor David Voas from the University College London. David is someone that we know well. We've worked with him. We've published papers with him, and he is really one of the great authorities in the UK and of the world in religious sociology. And he says there's a mountain of evidence to the contrary. So one survey isn't enough. The British Social Attitude Survey, which is a really highly regarded survey, run over the same time, said that attendance had not gone up. In fact, it had been going down still in the UK. It's been going down for many years. And he also points out the main Christian denominations publish their results annually in the UK, and they are not showing an increase. In fact, they've been showing an increase since COVID because there was a big dip since COVID, but not even a full rebound. I wonder what your experience in your church has been since COVID. I'm part of a Baptist church plant in the mornings on Sunday, and in the evenings, when I've got the energy, I go to the church that planted, our church plant as well, another Baptist church. And I can tell you COVID really smashed our church plant. When we came back, we were about 20 people, and it has not been an easy road since then. And many churches have found that. The Church of England in the UK is still about 20% lower than it was before COVID. So maybe there's some things happening, but it doesn't look like it's as simple as increased attendance. And the really obvious thing in these reports that should have raised eyebrows was they said more men are now going to church than women. Now, that would really be remarkable. I'm not criticising anybody, but in Australia, forever it's been 60-40 ratio of women to men. In the UK, it was even lower. It was about 65-35 in the UK. We have data from the UK because we've done partnership studies with them. So maybe something's happening, but it's not as simple as people are flocking back into church. There have been signals from the USA as well, from places like Barna, who, with similar surveys, have been saying that younger people, 15 up to 40, if you're 40, you can enjoy being called younger for a moment, are now the highest attending group, that more Americans are reading the Bible. But there was also another report saying that young men are joining, young women are not joining. In fact, maybe young women are leaving more in the US. But again, not everyone's convinced of that work either. We had contact with Conrad Hackett, who's the CEO of Pew Research in the USA, someone else we work with, and he said that maybe we're seeing patchy signs of recovery from COVID, and we get excited calls from people saying, "What are you seeing? It's happening, isn't it?" And they have to disappoint them and say, "No, well, we're not seeing evidence of this." It's probably truer to say that people in these polling samples, both these studies involved polling samples where you opt in to be part of the poll, not where you do a random sample of the population. And so there is something shifting that those kinds of samples might be picking up, but it's not happening in general across the population to the degree that we're actually seeing church attendance rise in the UK. I don't want to pour cold water on the whole thing, because clearly something is shifting. And my end point before we're going to have a panel come up and share the thoughts after my talk. I'm just going to talk for about another 10 minutes and then the panel is coming up. So we're not pouring cold water on the whole thing, but I think we're seeing something more nuanced than just, people are flocking back into church. We have two sources with the NCLS when we look at evidence from Australia. We have something called the Australian Community Survey, which we run almost every year now. And this is something that we started running in the 90s, but we run it very often now, nearly every year. And of course, we also have the NCLS, which you will know about. Just try the next slide. Yeah, so we'll go to the NCLS first. In the NCLS, we try to get an idea of how many people are going to church in Australia. You probably think that's easy, but it's actually not easy, because a lot of people don't tell us how big their churches are, and not every church takes part in the NCLS. About a third of churches in Australia take part. But we've done our best to get an idea of what's happened to church attendance, particularly since COVID. And you can see, just go back one slide, you can see there, there's going up to COVID, and then suddenly 2021, wow, big decline. Not surprising, you weren't allowed to go to church in a lot of places, so we expected that. But it didn't just spring back up afterwards. Can you see 22, 23, 24? It's been climbing back up slowly, and we are not yet back up to where we were before COVID. That's Australia as a whole. If we go to the next slide, you can see that it's been a different story in different denominations. So the Catholic Church, 92% of where they were before. Mainstream churches, by that we mean churches that are state churches in other countries, such as Anglican, Presbyterian, Lutheran, and the Uniting Church of Methodist background, and partly Presbyterian. Those have suffered the most. They're at about 3/4 of where they were before COVID. So it's not been the same across the board. Pentecostals don't appear to have fully bounced back. And I would attribute that partly to being Pentecostals are the best at attracting new people from the community who have no church background. So if you have to stop going to church for a year, you're not as likely to come back if you don't really yet see yourself as a church person. So their strength has also been a challenge for them here. The other Protestant, which is Baptists, Salvation Army, Seventh-day Adventists, those sorts of groups, have come back more or less to what they were before COVID. That doesn't mean every single church has. My church plant hasn't. We were touching 50 before the COVID hit. So that is telling you that there is a different picture even at the denominational level, and there is definitely a different picture at the local level. Back to the ACS then. We can ask a range of questions of the Australian population, and that's what the ACS is. The NCLS we ask in the church, the ACS we ask the whole Australian community using very well-drawn polling samples, what's called probability sampling. And these are the kinds of polls that they also use to try and predict elections, right? We know they get that wrong sometimes, but they're pretty good polls, about as good as you can get. So if you can go to the next slide, when you ask people about their spirituality and religiousness, you can ask them a range of things. You can ask them about internal things such as beliefs and about their own identity. But you can also ask about their personal behaviour, what they actually do, what they do privately, whether they pray, what they do publicly, whether they go to church, and what their experiences are. So there's a lot of things you can ask people about in relation to spirituality. So starting with some first results, that don't actually show a great deal of change. We ask people, do you believe in God? We ask Australians, do you believe in God? And we give them several options as to which statement would come closest. That graph on the left there shows how many Australians say they believe in a personal God, actually happy to call God God. That's about a quarter of Australians. And you can see that has barely changed over the last 10 years. It goes up and down a little bit. Samples do that. It's pretty stable. There's a second group of people who say, well, I don't want to use the word God, but I believe in something. I believe in a spiritual force or life force. There's something more in this universe than just the physical. Okay, so that's about another third, and you can see that's been pretty stable as well. So just take a moment while you're absorbing all this. More than half of Australians believe in a spiritual ultimate reality. Some will say God, some will say something close to that. That's an important thing to remember when you're thinking about who you're sharing with, who you're inviting to church, who you're rubbing shoulders with in school or uni or at work. We also ask people, how often do you pray or meditate? And again, we see something pretty consistent there. A third of Australians say that they pray every week, at least every week, or meditate. Not many people would be saying meditate, but that's obviously in there as well. We also ask people, how often do you attend church? Do you attend weekly? Do you attend a few times a month? Do you attend monthly? And that has been fairly stable as well. About 20%, you can see that hovering at around 20% of Australians say, I go to church at least monthly. So that was, we've taken all the categories together down to at least monthly. Now, we actually know this is a bit high, not because of the poor sampling. We just know that in self-report surveys like this, there's a group of people that are more inclined to be a little bit kinder to themselves in their answers than they really should be. It's social desirability influence. And the other reason we know that is because we count the people who go to church in the NCLS, and we know it's not that high. But nevertheless, if you do these surveys consistently, well, you'll get that same, you'll see if there's a change going on. And some people overestimate how often they attend. It's probably more like 12% of Australians are in church every week, or maybe 15, but it's not 20. However, there are some not strong patterns over the past decade that show there might be some possible signs of increased openness in recent years. So what are they? One question we ask is, have you ever had a mystical or supernatural experience, either positive or negative, about which you have no doubts it was real? And there's two options there shown for answers. About a quarter of Australians say, yes, I have. And another group, about the same, maybe a little bit bigger, say, well, no, but I know someone who has, and I believe it could happen. Again, along with more than half of Australians say they believe in God or something like God, more than half of Australians believe, it's good that this is kind of agrees with that, doesn't it? They believe in a spirituality, and they believe that they've either experienced something themselves or they believe it could happen. And maybe there's been a little bit of increase in that over the last few years, or maybe it's within the sampling, time will tell. But maybe there's a small bit of evidence there of greater openness. We also ask, would you go to church if you're invited? Would you like to see that result? Would you go to church if you're invited? By someone close to you, by a family member or a close friend, would you accept an invitation to church? Did you know that 4 in 10 Australians say, yes, I would? Or, yes, I probably would. That's pretty good odds, folks, if you're thinking about inviting someone to church. And, you know, if you invite someone to church and they say no, that's not persecution, okay? Keep trying. So 4 out of 10 is pretty good odds. I was amazed. I invited my brother to church. My brother gave up going to church a long time ago. But when my daughter was leading worship for the first time, he came along and he enjoyed it. So, you know, have a go, invite people and be somewhat maybe more confident than you might have otherwise have been. That a lot of people are somewhat predisposed, and maybe that's going up. Now we're going to look at generational differences because there's been all this talk about younger generations. And we do see some changes here, we think. So first of all, when we asked young people about their attendance at services, at least monthly, we said, how often do you go? This is the same question as before, but now it's broken up by age group. So that first tall bar there, the red bar, is those who are 18 to 34 years old. So basically Gen Z and a little bit of Gen Y, so the younger adults. And 30% of them say, yeah, I go to church at least monthly. Now, again, we know that's a bit high because there are 6 million Australians in that category, and if 2 million of them were going at least monthly, that'd be fantastic, but that's not what's happening. However, they may be going more often than we realise, and if they're only going monthly, they may be on the periphery of church, and they may be attending online. Do young people go online? Yes, they do. So there is a real chance that that's not all, complete hyperbole, that they actually are more leaning in, but we are not seeing that in flocks of young people in church yet, except that there are anecdotes. However, folks, I'm a quantitative researcher. Anecdotes are great. You can find an anecdote to support any pet theory or pet theology that you have, right? I'm interested in how many anecdotes are there really? Why don't we ask everybody? So that's what a survey does. When we ask people about their prayer, how often do you pray? Again, young people are not low on that. In fact, the lowest group is my generation, the Gen Xers, and if you're a Gen X, you already knew this. We grew up on a steady diet of cynicism, and many have held on to that. I'm glad that we haven't all. But we know, again, that young people are not low on this. We also have seen some differences in gender. We know that there is a difference between young men and young women when it comes to spirituality and religion. That's a real difference. For example, we know that young women show some signs of being a little bit more spiritually open than young men. For example, when we ask that God question, more of them say yes to the spirit or life force. So the same number roughly say, I believe in God. But when it comes to that next option of, well, maybe not God, but something spiritual, there's something there, young women are more likely to say yes to that than young men. Jumping down to the bottom of the slide, young men are more likely to tick the Christian box than young women in these surveys. Now, that's interesting because it's a 60-40 ratio of women to men in church. So why are they all ticking the box? There's something attractive there about that. And maybe it's not all good news because we know about some very, hard right, supposedly Christian stuff that is also getting the ear of many young men. So we have to interrogate that thought as well. But also more positive about Christianity and society in general. Whereas the middle of the slide says there's no gender difference in actually how much they say they pray or how much they say they come to church. So there are some differences in attitude, but there are not strong differences in practice that we can see. Maybe you can at a local level. We also, I want to share some thoughts with you that come from not just our studies, but from other studies around the world as well. Did you know that being spiritual and religious is good for you? Because there's a lot of cynicism out there saying the opposite. But studies have shown repeatedly in different countries that spiritual and religious people are more likely to say they are satisfied with their lives, more likely to volunteer in the community, not just in church. They're just more giving in that sense and more giving financially generously, not only in church, but also to other forms of need. There's many studies that have shown this. Of course, it's difficult to go out and crow being religious is good for you and good for the community. But if you carry that sort of conviction, then it's justified. We also know on the next slide that spiritual and religious people are more likely to feel hopeful and positive about life in the world. We asked a few questions in that regard. So I want to just conclude before our panel comes up with what are we seeing? Are we seeing revival? I think we can say we're seeing searching. We are seeing more searching. We are seeing more fluidity. We are seeing curiosity. in people. We're seeing greater openness in some, not in all. There are different groups in society. And just before our panel comes up, I want to take a moment to say, well, what does this mean? We talk about what we can see in the research. I want to just kick us off with some few thoughts for the panel as to what does this really mean? First of all, people are not returning to church if they were never there in the first place. They didn't leave. So we're looking at a group of people that are interested, that have no history. And someone else said that, something like that earlier today. Perhaps a better word is orbiting the church. And when you're orbiting, you might come in closer over time, or you might just fly off again. And how the church behaves and what sort of spaces the church creates will make a big difference in that. There will be some that will come in of their own accord. If we just receive them, we don't have to change anything. We can just sit back and say, well, they're coming in. But there is another group that are waiting, that are looking from a distance. And we do need to ask ourselves, well, if it's not going to be church as we know it because it's not what they have in mind, what can we do to connect with this group? We're very challenged by that in my church plant. We reach out to students at the local university, many who are from overseas. So all this stuff about Gen Z and Gen Y, it's completely irrelevant if you grew up in India, okay? Those categories don't exist in every country. They're Western categories because of the post-war boom and because of immigration and things like that. We're talking to people that are very open. We've just run Alpha. We've got people right on the edge of coming to Christ. They're very curious, very open. But what are we prepared to do that's different when they're not ready to be Aussies? They're not ready to be in an Aussie church. They don't even know what church is. And some of them are only here for a short time. They're going to go back to their culture. So we're very challenged by that at our church. Why is it younger people? Folks, I think it's always been younger people. Younger people are people who are struggling with meaning, seeking meaning and forging their identity for their adult life. It's always been so. 80% of Christians say they became a Christian before they turned 20. Okay, so we shouldn't be surprised when we see changes in society. We shouldn't be surprised that it's herds of young people that are being pulled around by these opinions, because they are the people still struggling with meaning, still forging an identity, and haven't yet, dare I say, hardened or rusted on to something. And there are older people as well who are interested, and the current influences of society are impacting lots of people in lots of ways. I'd have to say I see an undercurrent of cynicism in a lot of the challenges in society today. When you hear people talking about climate change, when you hear people talking about the cost of living, when you hear them talking about gender confusion and other people's reaction to gender confusion, when you hear about this general crisis of meaning, which has been a really strong term that people have used, so many people are saying, what's the point? Why bother? And yet, as my son pointed out to me recently, who's a young Baptist pastor, he said, there's a genuine element of pushback around young people who don't want to say why bother, who want something real and are willing to listen. And that's why certain influencers are having such success, because when you promise something that's secure and certain, it's attractive. And we need to remember the gospel is attractive because it offers the greatest security and certainty of all. It's not getting exclusive airtime in Australia anymore. There are other voices, and it doesn't get absolutes like it used to. But it's becoming clear that religious identity is fluid, just as other socially constructed identities can be fluid. Some people are moving into church, some people are moving out of church, some people come back again. Other studies have shown us that recently. But what might it mean for us with people who are curious and who are open? So I would encourage us as we consider our churches and as we at NCLS continue to mention and measure what's going on. Are we prepared to reimagine how we create community in our church and on the edges of our churches? What should we be prepared to change? Will a new wineskin sometimes come from the hide of a sacred cow? Will new wineskins be needed, and the old would burst and ruin the wine if we try to stick to using them? Thanks for listening. We're going to have our panel now.
Thank you, Sam. Joining us for the panel is Louise Bartlett, who is the team leader for Children's and Families Ministry with the Baptist Association. She also serves on a national task force around generations. If you guys can start setting up the chairs, that would be amazing. We also have Zak. Where are you, Zak? Yes, and Natalie, why don't you guys come forward? Zak is the teaching and young adults pastor at New Vine and a lecturer at Morling College as well. And Natalie is a pastor at Blacktown and a chaplain, and you also serve at Greater West for Christ, overseeing the young adults and youth stuff there. How good is that? Why don't you make these guys feel welcome? I've got some mics. We can't see each other very well, so maybe if you come around a little bit. We're just going to have a conversation flowing out of what Sam mentioned, and as Steve said before, we're going to then spend some time together praying after this, trying to capture what God is actually doing, recognising that each of us have a unique church experience and what we're seeing on the ground, and so being able to dialogue around that will be really interesting. I know for us as a small Baptist church on the Northern Beaches, we had 4 people baptised this year that have no faith background, 2 of whom were Gen X, if you can believe it. Yeah, who would have thought? And it was just quite a remarkable moment where one of them had a dream and turned to the other one and said, we need to go to church. And so they did. And then we had 2 young adults who have come to faith and been baptised. It was through SRE ministry. And so there's a real mixed experience that I imagine as you guys begin to pray, you will unearth stories of what God is doing in your own churches. Zak, I'd love to start with you. How do you respond to this increased openness to faith?
Yeah, well, I think especially kind of coming off some of those later comments from Sam, for me, I'm just so, well, I'm myself curious and hopeful for what God might be doing right now, because I don't know about other people, but for me, I kind of have this assumption that people are quite antagonistic to faith and are kind of ready with their Richard Dawkins arguments against, the faith that I hold. But I think more and more, especially young people, are coming with more of a blank slate in terms of, what they think of Christianity, and because they haven't grown up in that kind of context. And at the risk of sounding anecdotal, just to speak from my own story, is like I come from a non-religious, secular kind of family context, and for me, I found Jesus so compelling and so fascinating, and I had a million questions. And Jesus is compelling. I think that we just need to present Jesus and represent Jesus in a way that is compelling. So I'm hopeful, and I think the call for us is to talk about Jesus, to engage with people in a way that is compelling and kind of represents how good news. How good the good news that we have is. So, yeah.
That's fantastic. And I think what we've seen through other research that we've done is that confidence, and it's not a confidence in ourselves, it's a confidence in the gospel and the person of Jesus, that actually leads to more people responding to discipleship. And so, yeah, that's a fantastic way to lead us in. Louise, what are you seeing on the ground?
I think of our youth group at the church I'm part of. I was leading youth last night. They want to pray for longer. They want to discover more of what's in the Bible. Young guy who is from a Hindu family, he's sure that God is speaking to him, because when he's playing online and he thinks about sledging someone online, he feels like this voice tells him not to. And I say, I reckon that might be the Holy Spirit talking to you, and I think that'd be a good voice to pay attention to. But there's this hunger to be part of community, to be with other people who are thinking about what it looks like to follow Jesus. And one night we let a opportunity, you could either go upstairs for supper and games, or you could stay for some quiet prayer. nobody went for supper. And I found that moving. I found that encouraging. Makes me happy to go every Friday night.
That's great. Now, what are you seeing with all of your different hats that you wear?
Yeah, a few things. I think there's a massive openness to anything spiritual. It's not, and that is good, but it's also bad. It's good because they believe that there is a spiritual world, but it's bad because the things that they're throwing themselves into are things that are really evil. So I work in a public high school which has over 1,100 students. Less than 10 of those would have a decent understanding of the gospel. So we actually talk about Gen Z particularly, or the current high school demographic out in the Greater West, particularly the Penrith area, as an unreached people group, because less than 2% would have kind of heard the gospel or have a decent understanding. But they're very interested in spiritual things. I remember in 1 hour of the day at school, I had a kid behind me doing Satan worship. And then I had, like, legitimately, and then I had another girl, I said, what do you want to be when you grow up? And she said, oh, maybe a marine biologist or a demonologist. I don't really know. I was like, oh, okay, might I suggest the former? Yeah, they're really spiritually open. I have another girl who said to me earlier this year, like, 4 things in her life that were going really well. And the last one, out of the blue, was that she felt really close to God. This girl has been interested in witchcraft, and she's been coming across videos on TikTok of people talking about God and has been watching them, which is really interesting. So there's a real openness to faith, but no one's giving them the right things. And I think of Judges 2:10, which talks about after that generation had gone to with their ancestors, a generation grew up who neither knew the Lord nor the things that the Lord had done for Israel. And then they worship the Baals and the Ashtoreths, and they just all descends into chaos. And that's this generation because no one has told them the gospel. So a lot of New Age, but similar to what Louise is talking about, there's a real hunger for challenge and for something that is worth it. Like, young people are actually looking for something worth dying for, and we keep giving them like a just come and get hyped up and sit and then go home. And no wonder it's not quite working. Lego actually did some research. I talk about this a lot, so apologies if you've heard me talk about this. Lego did some research a few years back because they realised their sales were in the dumps. They're like, no one's buying Lego anymore. Why? And so they went into a whole lot of Gen Zers' rooms with permission. It wasn't creepy. And sort of said, what is the most valuable thing that you own? And what would you think would be a teenager's most valuable thing that they own? A phone.
Lego.
No, without fail, they actually said something that represented the hardest thing that they'd ever done in their life, like the greatest challenge they'd overcome. So for one kid, it was his ratty old skate shoes that he couldn't even wear anymore because he'd learned to skate with them. And Lego realised from that we've been making everything so easy. And we actually need to flip. So they flipped the strategy and made it the most pieces and the hardest thing, and their sales went through the roof. And I think there's a lot to be learnt from that.
That's fantastic. Really interesting as well. And we've seen stories of churches coming together, particularly young adults on the coast. We had a combined youth gathering on the Northern Beaches amongst the Baptist churches there, and young people hungry for the word, praying together, worshipping together. There is that desire for something bigger, something more, something that's full of purpose and meaning. Yeah, I was listening to Mark Sayers, who's a social commentator and pastor, reflecting on the McCrindle research that came out looking at the undercurrent of faith. And they were also discussing some of the research that Sam shared from the Bible Society in the UK and the Barna research in the US. And he was reflecting on the young people responding potentially in those other countries. And his observation was what they're seeing is older... what's the generation? Is it Gen X returning or even boomers returning to faith in Australia? Yeah, boomers returning to faith, particularly women. But this whole idea that the struggle is different in each of these regions. So in the UK and in the US, you have youth unemployment. You have a number of challenges of people through education and disadvantage. And yet in Australia, we have this demographic of people who having to juggle that mix of parenting their grandchildren because their parents are busy and employed, and they're also having to look after their aging parents and having to deal with their own sense of mortality. And so while it's really interesting what we see in terms of this openness of young people, what does it look like to not be exclusive and narrow focused in that way and recognise that God's at work in and through all generations? I have a question. So picking up some of the research that Sam mentioned from Barna, it shows that 38% of Gen Z women, and this is American research, now identify as religiously unaffiliated, which is notably higher than their male peers. And there's an Australian commentary that describes this as part of a quiet exodus of young women who feel unheard, unseen, or limited by outdated church structures. How can we ensure that our response to the openness, the potential openness of young men doesn't inadvertently overlook or alienate or oppress young women? Zak, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I don't have any thoughts that are too profound, but I do have a bit of a theological reflection. Like, I think it's really important for us to remind ourselves and remind our churches of who the church is meant to be. The church is meant to be a place where there's distinctions without divisions, is kind of how I like to put it, where there is neither Jew nor Gentile, slave nor free, male and female. And when Paul says male and female there, he's like kind of sacrificing good grammar for the sake of quoting Genesis 1, because he says, it doesn't say male or female, he says male and female. And so, in other words, the church is meant to be this kind of microcosm of who humanity is called to be, these diverse image bearers of God, kind of unified in Christ. And so if we're seeing this kind of, if we're seeing this disparity between who's represented in the church, then I think it's so important for us to remind ourselves and remind our people that the church is supposed to be male and female, unified in Christ. So
that's good. Louise, any thoughts?
When I think about it, I think of two words, belonging and discipleship. And so if young men are thinking that they will find belonging in the church because perhaps some of the commentary is there's a place you can have power, that's a discipleship issue, because actually we're not called to have power. We're called to be submissive and to serve and to lay down our life. So actually this is a discipleship thing. So as you come to find belonging in this faith community, you're going to need to discover the words, works and ways of Jesus. And that will be laying down your life, and it will cost you something. If you've found that you want to follow the words, ways and works of Jesus, but you don't feel like you belong, or that you feel like that the community you're part of doesn't do justice or love mercy, or walk humbly with God, but wants to declare that we don't have time for those who have been victims of abuse, or that we won't make room to share power, then that belonging, that discipleship becomes meaningless because you don't find belonging. The Barna research said that one of the things that the Gen Z women were looking for was intergenerational belonging. They were looking for older people who wanted to invest in their lives. And actually, I think this is core to what we need to be looking at. Those stats that Gen X are not reading their Bible or praying or going to church as much as Gen Z, that's a problem. Because if they look to the generations that go before them, and those generations that go before them don't seem to be hungry for God, like, is this worth giving up my life for? I think if we want to see revival, then all of us need to be willing to be discipled into the words, works and ways of Jesus. And all of us need to find community together.
So just to wrap, if someone was interested in taking a step towards either personally or thinking about their church responding to this increasing openness to faith, what would be something that you could say into that space, Sam?
I think I'd like to say to the Christians that we need to be aware that people aren't just going to come and assimilate into the church. And you've heard me say that again. I want to read you a quote. This is from John Vervaeke. He says, the main victims of the meaning crisis are the nuns, not the religious nuns. The people who tick no religion on the form are the main victims of the religious crisis, of the meaning crisis. They have no religious allegiance, but they are not primarily atheistic. They most frequently describe themselves with spiritual but not religious. And so we have to challenge ourselves, is our spirituality going to be genuine and authentic? We also I remember learning from the McCrindle stuff a couple of years ago, people don't want celebrity Christians. They want authentic Christian friends. And so one of the most precious things you can give your friends is your authentic self who trusts in God, who still stumbles, who still gets it wrong, but has faith. And you're probably going to look quite like some of the disciples if you do that.
Nat, what about you? What's a step someone could take?
I think somewhere where we have largely failed, which is an opportunity to now not fail, is we've failed to equip our young people to actually go and make disciples, to go and share the gospel. It's kind of like we've said, it's like we want the wins. So we want to be the one to preach the message that then has the altar call response. We want to be the ones that kind of run that. We want to be the ones to do it. Whether we realize that or not, I think that actually deep down is the case. And in doing so, we're actually robbing them of the privilege of getting to make disciples. And so I would say that every single church, every single youth ministry should be equipping your young people to go and share the gospel. In Blacktown, we've kind of gone, we would love to see 50,000 10 to 18-year-olds hear the gospel by the end of next year. That sounds insane until you think about, okay, when the number of people who say that they are Christians in that age demographic, if every single one of them could be activated in their faith and would share the gospel with 12 different people over a 12-month period, that's one different person a month, you would have 50,000 people just from teenagers sharing the gospel that would hear the gospel. And to kind of flip the script from it being responses of faith to the gospel to just let them hear it and then let the rest follow. This can be a bit of a helpful image. Like if I have a grenade and I pull the pin and I throw it, what's going to happen? What's going to happen? It's going to go boom. What happens if a 12-year-old boy pulls the pin on the grenade and throws it? Same thing. 5-year-old girl? Same thing. It's the same with the gospel. It doesn't matter whether it's a 50-year-old man, a 22-year-old youth leader, a 12-year-old boy, a 5-year-old girl. When you share the gospel, it's going to go boom. And God will do what he will with that. So I would say equip your young people to share the gospel because that will change everything. They are the ones who are positioned the best to go and actually make disciples among their age demographic. We just don't have that space anymore. We don't have that privilege. And if I want to see the school that I'm in go from being an unreached people group to a reached people group, then that has to come from the kids.
Amen. Thank you, Nat. Zak?
Yeah, I think really simply for me, from my perspective, it's let's just assume that young people are wanting faith with substance. Something that's substantial. Like up in the Hunter, we're seeing this a gathering, interchurch gathering, a worship night that happens occasionally, where a bunch of churches are getting together to about 200 or 300 people getting together to worship together, have Bible readings, have someone share a testimony, and this is largely led by Gen Z. It's largely led by young people who are just like, we need something more. We need this kind of outlet to worship God, and we want it to look unified. And so I think if we can just have conversations with our young people of what are you excited about, or what could be, to dream together, to equip, and to make something happen, I think that there's going to be so many more good things that can happen if those conversations are had. Just be my thought.
My encouragement would be to make the first thing you do when somebody has a dream, a vision, or watched a TikTok video and rings your church and says, I want to be baptised, because it has happened, that you ask a question or you say, I'd like to meet. My parents are in a Baptist church, and they were delighted to share with me about a young woman who bought a pink Bible off Amazon because she and her sister were searching and they wanted to find out about Christianity. That woman rang a church who she thought would baptise her and said, I'd like to be baptised. They said, well, you'll need to come every Sunday for a little while so we can get to know you. And she just said, oh, okay, and hung up. She rang another church, one of our Baptist churches, and said, I'd like to be baptised. And that pastor said, I would love to hear your story. Turns out she works every second Sunday. That's why she couldn't go. So start with the question, I'd love to hear your story. I'd love to hear what God's been doing, and then go from there.
So helpful. Thank you, guys. Why don't you thank them? And now we're going to do the right next thing, which is to pray.
It's the third P, that's right. So what stood out to you? What has God been reminding you of through that sort of fire hydrant of information, of encouragement, of challenge? Find a couple of friends, just for a minute or so, this is something that stood out to me, and then spend 5 minutes in prayer together before we move to the next thing before lunch. So we'll take about 7 or 8 minutes all up. Just reflect quickly with a friend. This is one thing that stood out to me, and then pray together.